And welcome to our Buck Run Baptist Church Bible study in the book of Exodus. We're doing this at midweek. So glad that you tuned in. If you're watching this live on a Wednesday evening, if not, I'm glad you're watching it whenever you are. And last week we left Moses as a baby, where he was named Moses. Now Moses is really an Egyptian name, but it has the same consonants as the Hebrew. It sounds like the Hebrew word for drawing out. And we see that in the book in verse 10 in Exodus chapter 2. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, indicating she formally adopted him. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. And so we remember last week in the previous study, we saw that water is very, very important in Egypt. Egypt is really the nation of the Nile, and water is going to be very, very important. Then God's going to take Moses into the wilderness where there's not going to be a lot of water. It's going to be very dry. But ultimately, God's promising to take his people to a land that's not flowing with water, but with milk and honey. And so the book of Exodus is really the story of how God is doing that. So we come to verse 11. Notice that we're going to see Moses has a lot of similarities to the way the story of Moses is told with really the way the story of Jesus is told in the Gospels. You have an infancy narrative, and in all but Luke, you really don't have any stories from Jesus' childhood. Only Luke gives us that one scene when Jesus is 12. Everywhere else, like in Matthew, he's a baby, and then he's grown. And in Mark, you don't even have an infancy narrative. Of course, John starts before the foundation of the world. But they don't spend a lot of time with his childhood, and that's the same way with Moses, other than this infancy narrative that tells us how he becomes the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Excuse me. You only have really this Moses now he becomes an adult. There's no childhood story. So one day, verse 11, when Moses had grown up, and that went fast. You think your children's childhood years go fast? Moses went very fast. He just grew up in one verse. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. Now that is an important detail, because Moses is what? He's a Hebrew, and yet he's been raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He has at his disposal all the wealth of Egypt. He is a child of privilege, if you will. But notice, he identifies with his people. We know that his own mother had nursed him and had reared him. Probably by the time he was weaned, his first language was Hebrew, so he would have spoken Hebrew and Egyptian very fluently. And when Moses grows up, notice who is counted as his people. In his mind, even though he's a privileged son of Egypt, in his mind, he identifies with the people of Israel. When Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. A couple of things I want to point out. First of all, the ESV translates this in very good and elegant English. Let me tell you what it literally says in Hebrew. It says that one day he saw an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no man, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, why is that significant? Well, first of all, there's something of a progress here. An Egyptian man and a Hebrew man and no man. And this is sort of setting us up in some ways. First of all, it's delineating for us the difference in Moses and the Egyptians. He sees a Hebrew man being beaten by an Egyptian man. And then it says that he looked this way and that, and seeing no man, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now here's the question. What does that mean? Does it mean, do we read it like this? And seeing this way and that, He saw no man watching him, so he struck down the Egyptian. Or does it mean, looking this way and that, he saw no man, so he struck down the Egyptian? In other words, does it mean he saw no one who was willing to intervene on behalf of the Hebrew? And so seeing that there was nobody who was going to defend this Hebrew, he did it. It very well may be both of those things, but it clearly indicates that Moses makes this decision whether or not it means nobody was watching him, or no one else would defend this Hebrew man, or really some mixture of both. He strikes down the Egyptian and buries him. I mean, this is right off of one of those murder shows we see on television where here he commits a murder and then he tries to cover up the evidence. Now, I sort of think maybe Moses, I don't know, maybe he waited until the Hebrew was gone and he thought nobody saw it, or maybe he did it right in front of the Hebrew man that was being beaten and thought that he would certainly hold his peace about it. We don't know exactly what happened or what he thought. We know Moses murdered the guy. We know that he buried him in the sand where his body would not be found. And then he went out the next day in verse 13. Behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And so here, two Jewish guys are fighting amongst themselves. And Moses said to the man in the wrong, one of them was clearly in the wrong, and Moses said, "Why do you strike your companion?" Now, there is something of a law of hermeneutics, of interpretation in the Bible, that when you have really a major character, the first time that they speak, it sort of defines their character. I mean, the first time you have recorded speech of any major character in the Scripture, it's not meaningless speech. It means something, and it reveals their character. Notice that the very first thing, these are the first recorded words of Moses in the book of Exodus. And his first words are really about justice. Now, how do we know Moses? He's the great lawgiver. He's the one who's going to bring the 10 Commandments to Egypt. He's the one who's going to give them the law, and then the second law, the Decalogue, the Dodecalogue, the 10 Commandments and the 12 Commandments. Moses is the great lawgiver, and the very first thing he says is, "Why do you strike your companion?" It's an appeal to justice. You're doing the wrong thing. And man, that really is going to define who Moses is, isn't it? He's going to be speaking to the Israelites about right and wrong really for most of the rest of his life. But now, here's Moses, and he's concerned for justice. Why do you strike your companion? Why do you strike your brother? Man, you guys are on the same side. Why are you fighting? Why do you do this to a fellow Jew? And notice the sort of smarmy answer he gets. He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Now, if Moses' first speech defines him, I would say that the speech of an Israelite to Moses also defines that relationship. And his very first comment to Moses, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" Man, the Israelites are going to be saying something of that order to Moses a lot, aren't they? I mean, why did you lead us out here in the wilderness to kill us? Why did you bring us out here to starve and die of thirst? Who made you a ruler over us, a judge over us? Even his own brother and sister will throw that accusation at him at some point. So here Moses, the author, is giving us insight into his own character and the character of the Israelites and the defining relationship. His concern for justice, though he himself is one who has done injustice. He killed a guy. Now he fusses, he reprimands two of his Jewish brothers for fighting amongst themselves, and he obviously hasn't lived up to that standard. In fact, he's done worse than that, right? He's killed a guy. This is a defining moment of Moses' life. And he said, do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Oh man, when he says that, Moses realizes that what he thinks is his secret is not his secret at all. Then Moses was afraid. Surely the thing is known. Surely the thing is known. Moses' relationship to God is also going to be one in which, from this point on, Moses will always remind God of who he is. Moses really has something of an inferiority complex in his relationship with God. He's always going to say, who am I? Who am I that you should do this? He's going to say to the people when they challenge him, who am I that you should speak against me? This isn't me, this is God. And this really does define his character as well. And he says, surely the thing is known. And if there's anything Moses knows from this point on, it's that God knows everything about him. In this case, he's more concerned with the fact that the Egyptians might know this about him. And he's really not concerned about God at this point at all. He's worried about Pharaoh. And he said, surely the thing is known. And indeed it was. Moses knew that if the Hebrews were talking about it, the Egyptians knew about it, and it was going to make its way to Pharaoh. You can just imagine the kind of typical court intrigue there is in every royal court. You've got people that are vying for position and power and favor with the ruler, whoever that king or queen may be, and anytime they can cut someone else's throat in order to advance their own interest, they're going to do it. And no doubt there's somebody there that is glad to expose Moses' crime. And Pharaoh hears about it. And Pharaoh is angry. And Pharaoh, when he heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. So there's only one penalty for striking down an Egyptian, and that's capital punishment. So Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. Now, the land of Midian is an ill-defined place, but it's somewhere to the west and the north of modern-day Eilat, somewhere there in that wilderness, somewhere near Sinai. It's out in the middle of nowhere. We're going to see how the writer shows that here in a bit. So he leaves Egypt, and he goes out into the wilderness. He gets to the land of Midian, which is a good journey from Egypt, and no doubt a hard one. He's probably disguised himself in old clothes. He's certainly not wearing the Egyptian royal garments that he could have worn in Egypt. And he's there in Midian, and he sat down by a well. Oh, all right, first of all, notice water. Moses and water are very closely linked throughout the book of Exodus. And so he sits down by a well. But, hey, we've seen this before, haven't we? In Genesis chapter 24, when Abraham's servant goes searching for a bride, and he goes to a well, and there he sees Rebekah. And Jacob, when he is on the run from Esau, just like Moses is on the run from Pharaoh, he gets to a well, and there he sees Rachel. So here you have another well scene, and in fact, there's going to be women involved here, very much like in Genesis 24 and Genesis 29. A little different, we're going to see. But anyway, he sits down by the well. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Now, this is fascinating. Here, first of all, you have 7 daughters, and that's certainly the number of fullness, of completion. You've got this priest of Midian. Now, we really don't know anything about him. A priest of Midian, in what way? Is he related to the one true God? Is he a priest of false gods? What God does he know? We don't know anything about him. We know he has 2 names. His name is Reuel, but he's also called Jethro in later chapters. The first name he's introduced by is Reuel. He has these 7 daughters. So instead of one woman as in Genesis 24 with Rebecca and Rachel in Genesis 29. Gee, these women whose names start with R are confusing me. But here you don't have just one woman. You have 7. It's a very different scene. He has 7 daughters, and they're watering their father's flocks. Now, this is fascinating to me because no doubt you probably had other women there with Rebecca and with Rachel, but there the author focuses on the one. It's not love at first sight for Abraham's servant, but it's love by proxy. He knows this will be a great bride for my master's son, for Isaac. And in Jacob's case, Rachel is the one. He's laser focused on her. But here, Moses is going to have a very troubled relationship with Zipporah, his wife, we're going to see. And it's interesting that he doesn't focus on just her. It doesn't say, and there was Zipporah, the daughter of the priest of Midian. He could have said that. We don't need the added detail in a sense that there are 6 other sisters. But the fact that she's one of 7 instead of a standout sort of says something about where that relationship is going, quite frankly, even though he's going to marry her. So these 7 daughters show up, and they're watering their father's flocks, and he's sitting there by the well, and the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up, rose, and saved them. Oh, what a glimpse that is into his character, right? What is Moses going to do? God's raising him up to do what? To save his people. And here's our first glimpse into that destiny for Moses. We saw him try and do it in his flesh down in Egypt. He rose and smote that Egyptian. Now, here he is in Midian, and he's a chivalrous man. He arises and he saves these 7 women by standing up for them against these bullies that don't want them taking the water. They want the water for their flocks. They don't want these women watering their flocks. And Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. Now, this tells us several things. First of all, he's a tough guy. He's not afraid to take on many guys. And he is chivalrous. He has a sense of justice. He thinks it's wrong that these men should drive away Jethro's daughters. And so he saves them and he waters their flocks. When they came home to their father, Reuel, he said, and by the way, that means friend of God. And so there is some kind of a relationship between Reuel and God, I think. He at least comes to one later. And he says to his daughters, how is it that you've come home so soon today? I think literally that means so quickly, in such haste. And there's a hint of humor in this phrase, I think. He's like, why did you come home so quickly when I think the intent is if somebody helped you, you should have stayed there a while. And they tell him the story. An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us. So there it is, man. What is it that Moses does? He delivers. What's his name mean? He's drawn from the water. And here he's doing what God raises him up to do. He's living up to his name. He's delivering them, and he drew water for them. He watered our flock. Verse 20, he said to his daughter, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. Bread is what we call a synecdoche. It stands for food, a meal. Let's break bread together. It doesn't mean let's just eat bread. It means let's share a meal together. And here he says, why didn't you bring him? And of course, here's a father with 7 daughters whom he has to marry off. And man, this guy has shown himself perhaps worthy of one of these daughters. He delivered them. He watered the flocks. This guy is brave. He's tough. He's a servant. Sounds like son-in-law material. And so he says, go get him. Verse 21, Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. Again, interesting fact. Moses and Jethro, again, Reuel and Jethro, the same guy. But Moses and Jethro will have and maintain a very close relationship. And here you have the very first thing. Moses is content not to dwell with these 7 women, but to stay with the man. He loves Jethro. Jethro loves him. And incidentally, Jethro gives him one of his daughters. There's no love affair here. There's no lightning striking like it did with Abraham's servant or with Jacob and Rachel. He loves Jethro. Jethro loves Moses. Moses has been chivalrous. He's a good man. So Jethro gives him Zipporah. Now, Zipporah is an interesting character. She's not in Exodus a lot, but where she is very telling. And I think they have a very complicated relationship. So when they get married, she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. Gershom sounds like the Hebrew for sojourner there. And he says, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So he calls him Gershom. I've been a sojourner there. That's his name, to commemorate that he was a sojourner. Now, even Moses knows, as a sojourner, that means Midian's not his final destination. I don't think he's got it fleshed out. I don't think he realizes that exactly what God's going to do with him. But he knows this isn't the last stop, or he wouldn't call himself a sojourner, a pilgrim. And he commemorates the fact that he's a pilgrim by naming Gershom. Now look at verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their bondage, their slavery, and they cried out for help. Now, so far, God has largely been absent in the story. You had God bless the midwives back in chapter 1 and verse 21, but really God doesn't appear in the story itself, in the birth of Moses. He's a silent and unseen figure. Obviously, God's involved. He's present. His providential care is working out all things, but he's not in the text. You don't see him at all in chapter 2 until we get down to verse 23. And look now at this barrage of times that God is mentioned and the verbs that go with his name. Their cry for rescue from slavery, from bondage, came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And God knew. Now, you've got to ask the question, God knew what? When the Septuagint translators, when they translated the Old Testament into Greek, about 300 years before the birth of Christ, that bothered them so much that they supplied an object of that verb, what God knew. But the Hebrew text doesn't have an object. The objectless verb prepares us, I think, for the divine address that is to come in the story we know as the story of the burning bush. But look at this description of God's character in the same way that Moses' character is defined by his speech and by the verbs used with him. He rose and he delivered, he saved. In the same way here, look at these verbs. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. So God hears their groaning. Man, isn't that a comfort to know that even though they had been in bondage all these many years, centuries, and their cries had gone up for a long time, it seemed like God was distant and not hearing. But God has been hearing their cries all along. God heard, and God remembered. What is it that when we pray, what is it that we ask God to do? Do we ask him to do our will? Well, a lot of people do, unfortunately. We make our prayers all about what we want God to do. But, you know, the proper prayer, the prayer that Jesus taught, is a prayer that is consistent with God's character, with God's promises, what God has already revealed about himself, what God has already promised to do. What did Jesus say we should pray? Hallowed be thy name. Do you think God has already declared he's going to make his name holy? Yeah. So what are we doing? We're discovering the desire of God, and then in prayer we ask him to do what he has said he will do. Thy kingdom come. Is God's kingdom going to come? Has God already shown us that? Thy will be done. Is God's will going to be done? All that we pray, give us this day our daily bread. Has God promised to give us our daily bread? So Jesus teaches us to discover the character and the will of God, and to pray the character and the will of God. So when we groan to God, when we cry out to God, we're not crying out, oh God, do something that I know you don't want to do. We're praying, Lord, be faithful to your promise. You promised never to leave us or forsake us. You promised that you would always be with us. And so we're crying out to you to show yourself mighty, to show your character. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God made a promise to them that he was going to bless the seed of Abraham, and he's going to bless all the world through the seed of Abraham. And so now God heard, he remembered his covenant, and God saw the people of Israel. Man, to think that God sees us right now, whatever our suffering, whatever our struggles might be, God sees them. God sees your loneliness. God sees your isolation. God sees the struggle. God sees the economic difficulty, even collapse. All of this is not outside of God's eyesight. He's not surprised by it. God sees his people. And God knew. God knew. That word means he has an intimate knowledge. To say he remembered means he takes it to heart. He takes to heart the covenant he made. He sees us where we are, and he knows. He knows what we're going through. He knows what needs to happen. He knows who we are, but most of all, he knows who he is. And so now the scene changes. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. Now, remember, Reuel means friend of God. Jethro means excellence. And so what a wonderful set of names he has. So you find that in the scripture, just like Simon Peter, 2 names. Also Cephas. And here you have Jethro, Reuel. He's excellent, a friend of God. And so Moses is keeping his father-in-law's flock as he led his flock to, and the ESV says, the west side of the wilderness. It's interesting, the King James translates this, the backside of the wilderness. The reason is because in Hebrew it uses a preposition, basically behind. So literally it says, he led his flock behind the wilderness and came to Horeb. And this is why the King James translates it like the backside of the wilderness, the backside of the desert. I like that phrase, frankly. I think God does some of his best work on the backside of the desert. He tends to take his choice servants to a very desert place, a wilderness place, the backside of the desert. He does it with Moses. He does it with Elijah. He does it with Elisha. He does it with John the Baptist. He does it with Jesus. In a sense, he does it with with Saul of Tarsus. 3 years he spends in Arabia when nobody's receiving him. But there God teaches him. And it's really, I think, there that he gains the full sense of his own apostleship. And so here's God. He's got Moses on the backside of the desert, behind the wilderness, away from anything and everything. And he comes to Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. It's a very stark place. And here's Moses on this holy mountain that's going to figure very prominently in Israel's history and certainly in their journey to the promised land. And so God is now prefiguring the way he's going to appear to Israel. He now appears to Moses there on Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire. Now let's stop right there and say that the angel of the Lord is God. It is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. The technical word for that is theophany. A theophany is an appearance of God. Now, this is where God, and I believe it's the second person of the Trinity, this is Jesus. Jesus is always, it's the second person of the Trinity that enters time and space where humans can see him and converse with him. But this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. In other words, he's not taking on true human flesh or human form. He appears here as a messenger, the angel of the Lord. And he appears in a flame of fire. Now that's, in one sense, not startling. God speaks from the fire in several different ways. We can we're fascinated by fire. Fire is powerful. Fire is unapproachable. There's a lot of things we can understand about why God would appear in the midst of a fire. But it's the next part of this verse that shocks us. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. What a strange thing. You know, a lot of ancient people worshiped trees. From the most ancient Near Eastern civilizations to the Druids, and even in modern America, we've got people who worship trees. But I don't know that I've ever heard of anybody associating God with a bush. Bushes are dry, and bushes aren't very impressive. You can't do much with them. You can't use them much for firewood. They burn up quickly. What good is a bush, especially in the wilderness? And yet here is a bush that is on fire, and yet we're told that it's not consumed. It doesn't burn up. The fire doesn't end. It just keeps burning. He looked, behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Well, this would get your attention. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. Now, if there's anything stranger than a burning bush that does not burn up, it's a burning bush that does not burn up that talks. And out of the middle of this bush, he hears a voice that knows him by name, calls him by name. By the way, what a picture of the sovereign will and grace of God. He knows who Moses is. He comes to Moses where he is. He draws Moses' attention. He calls to Moses. He calls him by name. And he woos him. Yeah, is Moses going to do the will of God? Yeah. Whether he wants to or not? Well, yes. But what's God going to do? He's going to change his wanter. And isn't that what God does for us? He calls to us. He commands us. He demands us. We might at first put up resistance, But the will of God's going to be done. He's going to change our wanter. And Moses here needs his wanter changed. God speaks to him. Moses, when he calls Moses by name, Moses said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Now, what makes it holy ground? Well, it's the presence of the Lord. And it's not the bush, it's not the fire. It's the fact that God is there. Now, at no time that God has spoken to any of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph, has he in any way performed a miracle. He communicates with Abraham very clearly, distinctly, like out of a friendship. He communicates with Jacob. He wrestles him. The angel of the Lord wrestles him. But there's no miracle. He gives him a vision, but there's no miracle. Here, Moses is going to be called to lead his people largely through signs and wonders. Moses' entire life is going to be associated with certain miracles. There's going to be fire that consumes people. There are going to be plagues and water from a rock and all kinds of miracles, manna from heaven, doves, all kinds of things are going to happen in his life and ministry. So God's first appearance to Moses is miraculous in this burning bush. And he tells him to take his sandals off. The place where you're standing is holy ground because I'm here. And he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now, several things here that are noteworthy. First of all, don't ever forget that Jesus is going to use this text to prove the resurrection to the Sadducees. When the Sadducees mock Jesus and make up this scenario about a woman whose first husband dies and 6 successive husbands all die, and then they laughingly, mockingly say to Jesus, "Okay, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be?" And Jesus says, "You err. You don't know the scriptures." Because God said he's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He's the God of the living and not the dead. Jesus bore witness that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still live. Though their bodies died and they were, as the text says, gathered to their fathers, they are alive. And so this verse is significant. In Mark 12 and Luke 20, Jesus cites this verse to say that God's the God of the living. But the other thing I want you to notice is that Moses hides his face. And this is going to be really a common thing with Moses. Moses has a genuine humility that he feels unworthy. He covers up. He's not so bold as to try and look at God. And the glory of God is so great. He hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. And well, he should be. He's a killer, a murderer. He fled justice, even though he himself has now twice stood up for justice. What an imperfect vessel. And here God is appearing to him, and Moses realizes he doesn't measure up to God, and he hides his face. Well, then the Lord said, and now the Lord's going to use 3 of the 4 verbs that are used down in verse 24. The Lord says, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings." So what is missing? The verb remembered. Well, how does God remember his covenant? I think this next part is evidence of God's remembering his covenant. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now notice, God says, I have come down to bring them up. What a picture of God's grace, isn't it? He had to come down to bring us up. This is a beautiful picture of what Jesus did. He came down to earth, to the suffering of his people. He identified with it. He heard, he remembered his covenant. He saw his people, and God knew. He knew what had to be done. And what had to be done is our redemption. And so he came down to bring us up out of our bondage to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But now this land flowing with milk and honey is not uninhabited, is it? It's a land flowing with milk and honey, yeah, but it's the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Here we have the first glimpse that going into the promised land is not going to be a cakewalk. It's not going to be easy. There are enemies to be cast out. And so it is that even when God comes down and delivers us out of the bondage of our sin, there are still enemies that have to be dominated and decimated and cast out. That's really what sanctification is. It's going into the promised land and claiming the rest that God has for us. But man, that rest is on the other side of defeating a lot of enemies. Here's the first glimpse of that. Now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Here's the news. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Can you imagine what's going on in Moses' mind? Who am I? I'm wanted down there. I have enemies down there. I'm not a fit vessel. And God said, but I will be with you. Notice, God answers the first question first and the second question second. Who am I? Well, you're the guy that I'm going to be with. I will be with you. And how should I go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel up out of Egypt? Well, here will be the sign that I've sent you. You're going to bring those people out of Egypt, and you're going to serve me once again on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Now, here's the first time we're going to have God tell us his name. He's called a lot of things. Elohim, El Shaddai, and we've got Adonai, a lot of names. El Elyon, the Most High God. We've had a lot of names for God so far, but now Moses asked him directly, hey, they're going to say, who sent you? Remember, what was the question they asked him? Who made you a ruler or a prince over us? They're going to ask that again, God. What will I tell them? And now God is going to tell Moses his name. And that's where we're going to pick up next time with one of the most significant revelations of God's character and his essence in all the Bible. And I look forward to talking to you about the great name of God that he reveals. And Lord willing, I'll see you again next week for our study in Exodus. God bless.